seek to provide examples from South African gold mines of the games different managers played, making out during the 1980s with the rise of the National Union of Mine Workers. So we're going back to an earlier period than the period that was covered by Crispin. Certainly both between mining houses and on different individual mines, managers adopted different approaches to the union with rather different outcomes, both for production and for industrial relations. And I'm afraid that given the limits of time, I'm not going to be able to give as many examples as I would like to do. Let me start with the Chamber of Mines, because that's the overarching management organization. The Chamber of Mines included representatives of each of the mining houses and has dominated gold mining in the country. While the fortunes of the different mining houses ebbed and flowed, the Chamber provided an overall sense of control. In the early 1980s, which is the period I'm talking about, the mining houses that made up the Chamber, mining houses provide managerial and engineering support for individual mines, although they don't own the mines. The mining houses included three powerhouses, Anglo, Gencor, and Goldfields, and three minor houses, JCI, which was a subsidiary of Anglo, and Anglo Vaal, with 2 mines each, and Rand Mines, whose portfolio included Harmony Mine in the Free State and a number of virtually mined out companies in the Witwatersrand. In terms of management style, to appropriate Michael's language, Goldfields, Gencor, and Anglo Vaal used a despotic style of management, whereas Anglo-American style was hegemonic. Rand Mines and JCI were mixed in their approach. Most interesting in terms of this paper was the situation at Gencor, which almost overnight in 1986 switched sides from the Goldfields camp to the Anglo camp. In 1980, General Mining, controlled by the Afrikaner company, Federal and Minbo, and Union Corporation became one company, Gencor. They struggled for several years to develop a coherent managerial policy, although in mining, the manager, Johan Fritz, established a reputation for tough top-down control. His main antagonist in the company was Naas Steenkamp, who reported to him but headed up their industrial relations unit. Steenkamp was the most liberal member of the Wiehan Commission and an ardent proponent of the negotiated approach to labour issues. Steenkamp set out to replace the old disciplinary style of management worker relations with a more governmental, consultative and participative approach. This brought him in direct conflict with Fritz. An old-style mine manager, Fritz firmly believed that blacks have a different cultural approach. They want to know exactly where you stand, otherwise they lose confidence in you. As a result, and for reasons of underground safety, one needed to maintain a structured approach toward mining methods and discipline. He thus proclaimed, "It is important to remain consistent with black employees and not to vacillate." Not that Fritz was particularly open to suggestions from his white subordinates either. Already in 1984, his top-down intervention in the face of alternative recommendations from virtually every other managerial participant had prevented resolution of an NUM-initiated strike at Impala refineries. The entire workforce was eventually fired, including the gardeners, one of the unhappy, more junior managers mentioned. A similar story could be told about the strike at Marievale Gold Mine in 1985, where the industrial court, in a precedent-setting ruling, ultimately decreed that unfair dismissals had taken place and obliged the mine to rehire the entire labour force of dismissed workers. Most important was the dismissal in January 1986 of over 25,000 workers from Impala's platinum mines, which also fell under Gencor management. And Crispin has mentioned this. Impala had refused access to the NUM, citing Bantustan, the Botswana rule, and a workers' committee in December 1985 presented management with a list of grievances and covering wages and working conditions, and requested that there should be recruiting facilities for the NUM. Fritz called in the Mokotów peace to break what was a very brief strike, actually. And the largest dismissal hitherto in South African history followed. The Bondestad state was profoundly satisfied with the outcome, but for Impala, the whole business was actually a disaster. Wildernessfontein North, which had not dismissed its entire workforce of the 4 different Impala mines, was back to full production in 2 weeks. The other 3 Impala mines took 6 to 9 months to return to normal production. Mass dismissals, and this had been proven already to Anglo, mass dismissals simply didn't work if you wanted to keep production going. In April 1986, 3 months after the Impala mass dismissals, and just as Fritz was about to fire Steenkamp, I mean, it was a matter of weeks before Steenkamp was going to get pushed. Derek Keyes, an outsider of mining, was appointed as chief executive of Genco. Fritz, who apparently thought he should have had the job, resigned in disgust, and with strong support from Keyes, Nas Steenkamp set out to reform Gencor's industrial relations policies. In the Chamber of Mines, Genco turned sharply 180 degrees from the hard-nosed Goldfields camp into what was perceived to be the soft Anglo camp. Steenkamp became a moderate voice to be reckoned with in the company and indeed in the Chamber of Mines. That's the chamber level. Let me switch now to talking about about developments within Anglo, because that's where I have most of my material. And I'm going to deal in turn first with head office and then with Anglo managers, who didn't always agree with their head office. In fact, often didn't agree with their head office. Anglo was the reform company, remember? So how did reform actually work out in practice? In the late 1960s, several senior Anglo executives, including the head of the gold division, Dennis Etheridge, had returned from Zambia, where labor relations had to be very rapidly overhauled. They were determined not to be caught battling again. Harry Oppenheimer was fully on board with a move to reform industrial relations in company mines. As early as 1974, Oppenheimer had recognized the undeniable existence of black trade unions and expressed a cautious willingness to negotiate with them. Oppenheimer's personal management style was an important influence at Anglo head office, by the way. As Bobby Gottsel explained to me, speaking of himself and his equally junior colleague, Hank Slack, Oppenheimer is a person who, for whatever reason, didn't like neat organization. He hated the word strategy, didn't like strategic planning, didn't like mission statements. He was a person who simply liked to have people around him whose ideas were interesting. And we had the capacity to take ideas to the Anglo executive pretty much whenever we put up an idea. So we had access to the Anglo to the Anglo executive. Look, we were located at 44 Main Street at the center of Anglo Power. We were still under the shadow of Beret, and we had backing from W.D. Wilson and itinerantly from Harry Oppenheimer, and we had quite good support from Gavin Relly. We were seen as 44 Main Street people, young men in short pants who interfered. Financial operating divisions hated us. Of course, not every suggestion from Bobby and Hank was taken up by the Anglo executive. They had to back up their arguments with evidence. But their access to executive deliberations was quite extraordinary. You need to understand just how junior these people were. If Bobby had not been at Anglo, he would have been doing honors in sociology with Eddie and me. At a more direct level, at Anglo head office, Collie van der Korf and Nigel Unwin headed up the Gold Division Personnel Office. In contrast to Goldfields and Genco before 1986, Anglo allowed union organizers relatively free access to the hostels. When I interviewed Unwin, he mentioned the taken for granted common sense that predominated at the Anglo Gold Division head office. It wasn't a conscious thing, he said. In fairness, I've never seen a union as an illegitimate force. I suppose it was more theoretical than anything else, but it wasn't something which concerned me. I've never identified the union as the enemy. And I don't think, with respect to a lot of people, that the consequences of opening the hostels up was understood by a lot of Anglo managers. I mean, this is the single most significant factor. If that hadn't happened, the NUM would never have got off the ground, in my opinion, anyway. I don't think people realized that until it was probably, in their minds, too late. It's just part of the philosophy that hostels were pretty shitty places to live, and if you could if you could at all do whatever you could to have them partially normal within an already strange setup, that was their right. We all shared that attitude. With hindsight, it was a critical element. Christ, we were young. It was totally disproportionate to the total impact, but that's just the way it was. Okay, that's head office. And head office is putting pressure on managers. At the mine level, the head office decision to open union access to the compounds created both problems and opportunities for local Anglo mine managers. For what it's worth, by the way, Goldfields and Anglo-Vaal never granted access until the 1990s, and effectively kept the union out by adopting brutally authoritarian methods of control, truly despotic in Bulawayo. Anglo managers split along clear lines of division, either to fight the union tooth and nail, but within the constraints set by head office, of course, or to try to cooperate with the local union leaders to ensure continued production. Neither was entirely successful in the early turbulent years of unionization. Managers themselves recognized the divide between them. And let me cite one of my interviews with Ken Dix, who was manager of Vaal East at the time. There were two schools of thought. I can classify them. These were, I would say, the hawks, and these were the doves. Van Gessel was a snow-white dove. He just believed you must be nice to the unions and that's it. Work with them and peace at any price and to hell with production and ta-da. So there were the two schools of thought within the gold division at the time, and we disagreed quite vehemently with each other on policy. I mean, giving them access into the hostels was just anathema to me. I just couldn't live with it. So that was kind of how it went, these two camps. And I don't know who was right. I'm too close to be able to know which was the right policy. This is after he's retired, right? Interestingly enough, when I spoke to Karel van Gessel, the snow-white dove, right, who was manager at Western Holdings when the union arose, and I don't have time to deal as much as I could with van Gessel, who's a fascinating figure. Van Gessel shared Dix's perception of the managerial divide. I said to Ken Dix, if you want to have a lasting kind of thing, then you need to get a negotiated settlement. A lot of people, those managers, thought that by soft saying about consultation or involvement or whatever to unions and employees would be abdicating management. And I said, that's not abdicating management, that's participative management. It's not to say that you must become inefficient. In fact, if it is used correctly, you should become more efficient. Van Gessel is very eloquent. And I'm sorry I can't quote more of him. He was also speaking for managers like Dick's neighbor, Dick Fisher, at Vaal Reefs West, two neighboring divisions within Vaal Reefs. One headed by Dick Fisher, who's a dove, and one headed by Ken Dix, who's a hawk. Literally overlapping with one another. I talked to another manager who said it was like different silos. Dick Fisher really tried to build relationships with NUM leaders and was despised by Dix for being soft and for wasting productive time talking to the union. Morris James, Dick's most valuable assistant, told me, the West Division, so far as I'm concerned, capitulated. Gave them the mine. They gave everything away. So there's this quite sharp division that goes through. It doesn't happen only at Vaal Reefs. It happens on scattered shafts at all the Anglo mines. they're the Hawks and the Doves. The Doves are perceived to have sold out to the Union by the Hawks. The Hawks are perceived to be, well, usually the Hawks got promoted, which meant that when Ken Dix, for instance, took over in the Orange Free State, he took over control of, eventually, of the entire Orange Free State Anglo operation. He basically, I mean, a lot of the soft managers resigned. They didn't want to work under Dix. And in fact, Dix appointed people deliberately to, as he put it, stop the Union running the mine. And he was quite successful, actually. But in the short run, in the long run, I think Dix himself recognized that there were problems with his approach. And so let me conclude. NUM leaders to whom I spoke respected Van Gessel enormously. And they respected Fischer too, for taking strong stands where necessary. They recognized that they took, I mean, these guys were not pushovers. They were managers, after all, but for striving always to be fair. In the end, of course, the Doves won out, and Anglo Mines moved much more successfully into the transition to democracy in South Africa than Goldfields ever did. And Dix himself recognized that. By that time, in Eric Wright's terms, class conflict in the mines had settled down to class compromise. On gold, Dix thought the turning point was the 87 strike. Prioritizing production, getting the gold out of the ground, as he put it, was the most important thing. And I quote him again. Often I have thought back, what could we have done? Even now I try to think. This is in 2002. He's been retired for several years by this time. What could we have done? Even now I try to think. Because some people tried to pal up to them and that didn't work. Other people tried to fight them and that didn't work. Other people tried to be scrupulously fair and that didn't work. Hard but fair. So I'm still at my wit's end to know what we could have done better. The only thing that brought sanity was the 87 strike, when there was a lot of pain on both sides. When they came back on our terms. Now I actually have the industrial relations files of Ken Dix's East Mine. And I would say from what I've seen in the management minutes, that management was also chastened by the 87 strike. The union might have abandoned the idea of taking control, but even despotically inclined managements also began to make concessions. And then a further complication emerges on the gold mines that just makes the story a lot more complicated. There is a drum roll of negotiating retrenchments. As the gold mines, as production dropped off, workers started to be dismissed. Retrenchments were always quite tightly controlled because of NUM's ability to negotiate quite good retrenchment agreements. But the retrenchment agreements were happening. And a new and different pattern of making out for both workers and managers emerged. But always, both mine workers and mine managers are obliged to planisa. Capital does not act. Workers and managers are the actors. Relations in production represent both the capacity to make out and the possibility of creative action. Thank you.
Great. Thanks everyone for a phenomenal day and a half so far. The discussions have really been quite remarkable. And before I start my input, I just want to say a few words about SWAP. Because we have to remind ourselves this is a birthday party. This is SWAP's 30th birthday celebration. And in fact, 20 years ago, I arrived in South Africa for what was supposed to be a 6-week vacation. And I was fleeing the graduate studies at the Institute for Development Studies at Sussex. I felt that these studies just weren't providing me with a way of understanding the world that could help me to change it. I couldn't see the relevance of graduate studies, and I was hoping that going to a different graduate school in North America would make the difference. And I came here in between. My family is South African. I had never been to the country. And of course, in 1995, I arrived and realized I was insane to think I should go and study in a university in the north to try to understand and help to change the world. And so I decided to stay, and I'm so very thankful that Anthea and Eddie at SWAP gave me one of my very first jobs in the country, working on the South African Labour Force Survey with guys standing. Right? Yeah, and I've maintained a relationship with SWAP over these 20 years. I left, as Rita said, I went and worked with the unions. I eventually did a PhD, came back, and through all of those years, I've really grappled with this question: what is the value of academic work and academic study? How can we bring it into relation with activism? And I really have to thank all of you from SWAP over the years and in this room, because really, as people have said, when I arrived at SWAP and saw how SWAP was critically engaging, at that time with unions primarily and then with movements, you've really shaped the way that I try to see myself as an academic, and hopefully will continue to take that with me in the geography department. And I am not yet in the geography department. I am still at SWAP as a senior researcher, and I have to say it is with a very heavy heart that I leave to join the geography department to become a permanent employee, which is something that, the precarious position of those of us in research institutes, but I will remain involved in the work of SWAP. And I do want to just note 2 things SWAP is doing right now that I'm privileged to be involved in, which is this research skills course for United Front activists and the new remarkable program on postdocs for social justice that Alberto is part of. And that SWAP is continuing to think of new ways of critically engaging with movements in this moment. And so it really is a privilege to have spent so many years engaging with SWAP, and I look forward to our 50th anniversary. So the talk that I'm giving today is called Making Something from Nothing: Insights into the Reconstitution of the Economy, Labor and Polity Gleaned from a Soweto Garbage Dump. And it's the first time, really, that I'm going to try and present one of the larger arcs of argument from the book I'm supposedly working on, which is called Rising from the Rubbish. And given that I work on trash, I was incredibly excited to see the title of Eddie's talk yesterday, Dirty Hands, Researching Working Life During and After Apartheid, and the fact that he started a conversation that Michael picked up around the relationship between dirt, getting dirty, and producing theory. Because what I want to do today is argue that conducting detailed ethnographic analysis of the contested social processes through which waste is turned back into value can provide important theoretical insights into how the South African economy and polity are being constituted, the forms that they're taking, and what this means for how they can be transformed. I think that focusing on the revivification of waste is particularly theoretically generative for 2 reasons. First, physical waste is something that's been explicitly cast aside by its owners as having neither use value nor exchange value. So when someone values it enough that they're willing to dig into the stinking, festering trash heap and retrieve it, we can be sure this is going to reveal something about the nature of inequalities, divisions, and connections in our economy. Second, in countries like South Africa, where we don't have formally established municipal recycling programs, the entire recycling system is predicated on the physical, and I'm going to emphasize intellectual labor, knowledge, skills, and organizational capacity of people who are erroneously dismissed in politics and in too much political theory as human waste, where this term came from, how it became so popular anyway, who are presumably cast outside of both the economy and the polity. And we see even supposedly critical left thinkers framing so-called human waste this way. Focusing on their historic agency and epistemic agency requires us to rethink conceptualizations of the economy and polity that exclude and dismiss them. And in many ways, I think there's a connection between what I'm doing here and what Gavin was doing yesterday, in terms of saying we need to move from the abstract to the concrete, from the abstract to the rubbish. You know, we're rising to the rubbish to develop concepts that are more adequate for understanding our current reality. So, although I'm focusing specifically on trash and the work of informal reclaimers, I'm trying to make some interventions into broader debates on the role of the informal economy and informal politics in constituting the current social order. So, the informal economy, as we know, was supposed to disappear. It's not supposed to be part of capitalist development, and informal workers weren't of interest to unions or academics for quite some time. But what's becoming very clear is that the informal economy is increasingly important not only in post-colonial societies but also in the North as well, and informal workers are organizing. What I'm trying to do in this talk, which is rapidly disappearing in front of me, is to engage with and bring together two bodies of literature that take very different approaches to thinking with and understanding the informal economy. First, we have scholars like Kalyan Sanyal, and I was really happy yesterday that people were highlighting the importance of us in South Africa engaging with Indian theorists. In his really important book, Rethinking Capitalist Development, Primitive Accumulation, Governmentality, and Post-Colonial Capitalism, he's trying to think through what he's trying to do is think through what the growing presence of the informal economy in countries like India means for how we understand capitalism. And he says that the informal economy isn't a sign of a stalled transition to so-called complete capitalism. It is helping us to understand the nature of capitalism in these contexts. And one of the things that he does that's really important is he says accumulation by dispossession, or primitive accumulation in countries like India in post-colonial contexts was about possessing resources, capital enclosing the resources, but not, as in the classical case, trying to transform people into wage labor and capture the labor. But what do we do in this instance? And he argues that in a democracy, there's a need for the government to then develop a politics in which they try to at least support people in the informal economy. So he's placing the informal economy at the center of reconceptualizing both the nature of capitalism and the economy in post-colonial context, but also he's thinking it through politically. This is really important, but I think the way he does it is extremely problematic because it's so highly structuralist and because it casts the informal economy primarily as being completely outside of and disarticulated from the formal. Then we get the literature that many people here are familiar with on organizing informal workers. And what's really important about this is that it's looking at how informal workers are actually coming together to develop their political agency. What I'm going to do is extend that work, because I think that not enough of that work is asking the broader political questions around what does this mean for the constitution of the economy and social order. And I'm going to do that, as you can see from the abstracts, by focusing not on explicit attempts to organize informal workers into unions, but to look at how informal workers, how reclaimers organize their labor process, and what that tells us about how they are constituting social order within the informal economy. So the presentation draws on, here we go. So it's based on an ethnographic study that I did at a garbage dump in Soweto called Marie Louise. Now this is a view of Marie Louise from the air. And you can see that from the air, it looks like a commodity cemetery. That's what it's designed to be. It's meant to be a place where waste is buried and nothing else is meant to happen there. But once you enter the gates, you can see that Marie Louise is a vibrant social space that is intimately connected to the city, the country, and the region. Marie Louise has spaza shops, restaurants, a gambling area, a church on Wednesdays. And I have to note that this entire social life at the garbage dump arises around the work of these informal reclaimers, and the entire recycling process at the dump arises from the work of the informal reclaimers. Because